Okay, we're going to get started now. Thank you everyone for coming today to the International Health Systems Conference that we've set up. I'm extremely excited about the program today and tomorrow. I think we have an excellent lineup of speakers that we were really fortunate to be able to collect and put together. And I hope that we are all going to learn a lot about broad, big picture details about international systems, but also some kind of specific aspects of those systems, especially to the extent that they have insights to bring to bear on US policy reform. To get started, I wanted to give a little motivation for the conference. And for this motivation, what I want to do is first kind of give some facts that are kind of very high level facts to motivate the agenda and the conference. Then dig in a little bit on some of the specific questions that we're going to go through with each speaker and with each specific context. Then I'm going to give you some logistics on the format for the day. And then we're going to get started with the first session. So I think most people on this call are already very well aware of the differences between both cost and potential effectiveness of the US healthcare system relative to other systems. There's many different ways you can show these kinds of facts in these kinds of charts. This is one way to do it. What you can see here in this chart on the x-axis are different countries around the world. And on the y-axis are the different average spending amounts for each consumer in each country. We've all seen this chart probably in 20 different ways, but I think to show this at the beginning of this conference is actually quite important in order to kind of motivate the different detailed discussions that we're going to be having. One of the clear takeaways from this chart is that the US spends much more per capita on healthcare spending than other countries, including other developed nations, in many cases double, triple, or quadruple as much. And not only are we spending much more in an absolute amount, but we're also spending much more as a percentage of GDP. And so, we see this chart many times per year, but especially for this conference where we're really going to be trying to dig into some of the details of how the US system is different than other international systems, I think it bears mentioning that we are spending so much more than other countries. And despite spending so much more, as you can see here in this chart, the life expectancies, which is a very broad measure of healthcare quality, are very similar across all of these countries, okay? Now, with these broad descriptive facts, you can always dig in more details and say, well, there's, for example, people in these countries have different lifestyles and things like that. But still, the facts are the facts, and the fact that the US is spending so much more per capita while ultimately having similar broad health metrics is very, I think, illuminating, and suggests that reforms could certainly be valuable and productive. So that's some big picture motivation, looking at kind of why the US, why are we here, and what are the differences between the US and other international systems at a very, very broad level in terms of outcomes. In a more specific sense, one of the motivations for the conference is that because the US system has so many idiosyncrasies relative to other health systems, researchers, including, I think, I would say myself and John and other researchers who are focused on the US, we become, I think, to some extent, highly specialized on the US institutions and the US features. And in some sense, we don't forget, but we let slide all of these potential insights coming from so much research in so many different countries around the world. And that research can really help us to a large extent when we're thinking about policy reforms in the US. So there's both incremental policies that this research can help to reform or can help to inform. So for example, adding a public option to exchange markets is what I would consider to be an incremental policy. And you could also think of disruptive policy. So for example, thinking about a more UK style system or Taiwan style system relative to what's happening in the US. And the key underlying question kind of behind all of these differences and these specifics that we're going to talk about is how do different systems effectively ration care? So how do systems kind of effectively ration healthcare relative to one another? In some sense, this is a central question in health economics, yet because we're often so focused on some of the specialized details, we don't necessarily kind of discuss health system design and policy design at that kind of higher level. Okay. So the key objectives today, and each speaker will kind of engage with the objectives in their own ways. Are first to kind of describe, and so to help us just kind of have a baseline for what are the key features of international health systems, and specifically the ones that they're talking about, and how do they differ from the US, as well as how they're similar to the US. A second objective is what evidence is there on the differential effectiveness of these alternative designs. So there's a lot of evidence that some of us are aware of and some of us may not be aware of. And this evidence can have a lot of value for the US policy debate, but may not actually typically be included in key discussions. And the final objective is how can this evidence be brought to bear in the US policy reform discussion, okay? And as I talked about kind of just a second ago, I really view this as evidence that could lead to incremental reform, which is smaller in scale but easier to implement, or disruptive reform, which is larger in scale but obviously harder to implement. So moving to the details of what we're going to do in each session. The format is going to be 20 minutes per talk, and I've listed uninterrupted here since most of us are economists and we're used to interrupting. Then we're going to do 10 minutes Q&A at the end of each module. So most of the modules have two presentations. So we're going to have 40 minutes of presentations and 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. For the Q&A, during the session, so while speakers are presenting, it would be great if you could enter your questions in the Q&A feature in Zoom. If you have any questions about that, you can let Kathy know or Cynthia know. It should be fairly straightforward. If for some reason you can't figure out how to use the Q&A feature, you're welcome to type your question into the chat, and hopefully we will see that. One important thing to mention is that closed captioning is enabled on the Zoom if you want it, and you can select that option if that's something you want. To turn that on, it's just at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and that can be turned on quite easily. If you have any questions about that, please let us know. Finally, each day there's going to be a moderator. Today it's going to be me, and tomorrow it's going to be John. And our job is going to be to keep time and facilitate the questions. The plan for questions is for us to collect the questions and relay them to the speakers. One additional thing to mention is that in the Q&A feature in Zoom, you can vote up or down questions. And we'll certainly take that into account when thinking about kind of which questions to use the 10 minutes for. Okay, before we get started, I wanted to mention support for the conference and thank a couple people. First, this conference is supported by the very generous donation of Robert Field. Robert is the president and founder of the Real Reporting Foundation and healthsystemsfacts.org, which is a website that's dedicated to propagating the kinds of facts that we're talking about here. Our discussions with Robert on these issues have been very illuminating, and I think that especially we share the goal of really trying to bring neutral, fact, evidence-based kind of health policy insights to policy debates in the U.S. And for many of you who kind of follow typical policy discussions, I think we can all agree that more facts and more evidence-based analysis would be kind of very valuable as a central part of those discussions, okay? I'd also like to give special thanks from the Gilbert Center to Kathy Garza and Cynthia Okita. They've done an absolutely tremendous job. I'm sure many of you have been in touch with them during the course of setting this conference up. So thank you very much to them. Okay, so with that in mind, we're gonna move right into our first session. And our first session is on nationalized health systems. And so the first session is gonna have talks by Carol Proper and Sung Mai Chang, the former on aspects of the UK system and the latter on aspects of the Taiwanese system. So we will move to that now. And so Carol is going to get us started there. So take it away, Carol.